Our topic for live discussion today is from Slovakia, where the anti-Ukraine, pro-Kremlin and anti-American leader Robert Fico is all set to replace the caretaker administration, which has been running the country since May. This also means that NATO will have its first leader who is prone to Putin's Russia. He's all set to replace a technocrat government that has been backing Kiev against the Russian invasion for a long time now. Now, the question is, what kind of impact will it have in the ongoing Ukraine-Russia war? To talk more on this, we have with us Mr. Ben Aris, founder and editor-chief of BNE and Telenews, and also former Moscow bureau chief of the Daily Telegraph. Well, Mr. Aris has been covering Russia since 1993. Thank you so much for taking our time and joining us in WION yet again, Mr. Aris.
Pleasure.
Right, and Mr. Aris, Slovakia is a member of the NATO alliance, which is obviously, we've been tracking how it has been backing Ukraine against Russia. But now, with Fico in power, how will that change the dynamics going forward?
It could change it a lot, in so much as Fico is well known as being against the war. I mean, he's been repeating the myth from the beginning that the conflict in Ukraine started as a civil war between the separatists in the Donbass and the Kiev government, whereas, quite clearly it was an invasion by Russia. And it's representative of the growing fatigue with the conflict that is going on in the West. It's been going for a year and a half now. It's cost a lot of money. I mean, getting on towards $150 billion. It's caused an energy crisis in Europe, and that's seen the economies across Europe slow down. And those countries, particularly ones that are dependent on Russia, the ones closest to Russia for energy, have been hurt the most, including Slovakia. So what this represents is the growing weariness with having to pay for this war indirectly through high prices for energy, and it's slowing down the economy. And Fico is going to, it looks like, drift towards the position that Orbán in Hungary has, which is definitely against the war. They just want business as normal. They want to go back to getting cheap energy from Russia. And so they're getting tired of it. So this is another sort of crack in the alliance, the unity that the European Union has shown up until now, which has now got a little bit worse.
Absolutely, Mr. Aris. Just adding another point to the list that you just mentioned here, Fico has clearly asserted and pledged to stop supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia, and he's clearly cited that Slovakia has bigger problems to deal with.
Indeed. I mean, the most obvious part of this is like who's connected to Russian gas, and the old Soviet system piped gas into Europe, and it got to the countries, on the eastern border of the EU first, and that includes Hungary and Slovakia. They both continue to be dependent on Russian supplies of oil and gas. And indeed, they had an exemption from the embargo that was imposed at the start of this year, and are allowed to continue to import oil, for example. The gas is gone because of Nord Stream 2 pipelines were blown up. But they still dependent on this energy inflows. And indeed, exports going east from Central Europe, Russia remains or was a major trade partner for them. And their economy is hurting. And so they're putting their national interests ahead of those of the European position of supporting Ukraine in its conflict with Russia.
Right, Mr. Aris. Now, we spoke about the impact of Fico's victory in the ongoing Ukraine-Russia war and how it may also lead to cracks within NATO. Let's also talk about as to what kind of changes can we expect in the country's internal diplomacy.
Well, it's going to lurch back to the right, and Fico was in power before. However, he had to resign, I think it was in 2018, after there was a journalist who was murdered, who brought up corruption charges against his government. And the corruption in Central Europe remains a serious problem. The same sort of allegations have been brought against Hungary. And there's a general lurch away from the sort of values-driven EU project, which we're also seeing in Poland. There were 1 million people on the street yesterday in Poland protesting because they too also have key elections in 2 weeks' time. And the ruling PIS party there has been undermining the rule of law, has been undermining the independence of the courts. And the people were out yesterday, protesting, saying that Poland is at a turning point, the most important elections it's faced in 30 years. And we're seeing the same sort of drift to the right, same sort of drift towards authoritarian rule, or at least less democratic rule. And I think we're going to see the same thing in Slovakia, because Fico is cut from the same cloth as the ruling party in Poland, and also Orbán in Hungary.
Absolutely, Mr. Harris. Now, Fico's party, Smer SD, garnered 23% in Saturday's vote, beating the centrist progressive Slovakia at 18%. What led to the change in vote? List some factors that helped Fico win the elections in Slovakia.
Indeed. I mean, it's not a done deal yet. He didn't get a clear majority, so he's going to have to go into a coalition. It's likely that he will hook up with HLAS, which was a breakaway party from his own party, and then they would form a government. However, I mean, internally, like I say, the polycrisis, the rising inflation in particular, the rising cost of living in particular, has hit home with consumers, with voters in these countries. And while in principle they support Ukraine's fight against Russia, in practice, people are having to pay more for food. The rent's gone up, the prices of energy has gone up to very painful levels. And so there's a tolerance level that I think is being approached, whereby the voters are easily persuaded that this is costing us too much. It's not our fight. Ukraine is not a member of the EU. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. This is a fight between Slavs. It's nothing to do with us. So we've done our bit, and enough's enough. We want to go back to having a comfortable life and to see all these problems go away.
Right, Mr. Harris, you have covered Russia since 1993. What kind of changes can we expect in Slovakia-Russia relations, especially after Fico doubled down on pro-Russia stance after his victory?
Well, and the Kremlin must be extremely happy about this, because, I mean, Putin's playing a long game, and I think he assumed that, well, he was surprised by the unity that the European Union showed at the beginning of this war. I mean, we were all surprised. I mean, it was absolutely... The sanctions came in were absolutely extreme, out of left field, and the EU has worked very hard to make them work. And also, as I said, they paid at least $1 trillion, or euros rather, in terms of subsidies. And that the Kremlin was surprised, I think, that they managed to do that and hold the union together. Because one of the problems with the European Union is that every single decision has to go through with a unanimous vote, which means every single country has a veto. And yet none of them have used it yet. The European Union under von der Leyen has managed to marshal all of the members of the EU in order to keep voting through these 12 rounds of sanctions. But that's only going to last for so long, and I think this is Putin's plan. It's just going to keep the pressure on, keep the prices high. He sent grain prices up, he sent energy prices up, which he has control over. He sent fertilizer prices up, diesel, there's a shortage now. Right. And all of these things put pressure on the EU, and eventually we're going to have what we're seeing now is that the resolve is going to crack, and people saying enough, we pay too much, this is not going to be in our interest, and so the European Union unity will fall to pieces, and then just one country needs to veto things. Orbán is vetoing one transfer because he wants to see some sanctions taken off one of his banks, and that is going to get progressively worse the longer this goes on.
Well, absolutely, Mr. Harris. We'll have to wait and see the impact and the aftermath of Fico's victory in Slovakia on the ongoing Ukraine-Russia war and also within NATO. But thanks very much for taking our time yet again and joining us on WION with your insights.